with today's webinar. So welcome everyone to the March Integrative Conservation webinar. And I just want to do a brief comments before we go into today's event. I just want to remind you that we have the March issue of Integrative Conservation published online. So then you can go online and you will see our latest issue. Also, I want to do a couple of very quick announcements about the upcoming events. So in May, we'll have Professor Stuart Pym, Emeritus Professor at the Duke University, talking about the 30% solution is neither necessary nor sufficient. And then in April next month, we'll have Professor James Watson from the University of Queensland talking about area-based conservation, specifically in the context of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And after these brief reminders, I think we can start with today's event. So I think, Richard, if you want to share your slides anytime, I just will briefly introduce the speakers. Today we have a new format. So if you have been attending the recent Integrative Conservation webinars, you saw we had a roundtable last month, and we had a masterclass or a simple presentation in January. And today we'll have a slightly different format. We'll have a main speaker, Professor Richard Corlett, and I think you all know Professor Richard Corlett. He's an emeritus professor with us in the Xishuangbanna Tropical Botanical Garden, and also an associate researcher at the Royal Kew Botanical Gardens in London. Richard was born in the UK, in London, but he spent around 40 years working in tropical Asia. He became, we can say he's probably the most knowledgeable ecologist in tropical East Asia, and he has written the reference books. He's the person that we all go to when we want to know something that it's difficult to find, or we are not very clear about the region and ecology and conservation in that part of the world. Richard kind of retired recently, not fully. He's still very active, and he will continue to be active for a long time. And he's physically back in London, and I think he has been shifting part of his interest from tropics to his homeland or hometown in London. And today he will be talking about a paper that is coming very soon in Trends in Plant Science, and is achieving zero extinction for land plants. So Richard will talk for around 40 minutes, and after Richard, we'll have a respondent. We'll have Dr. Kwek Yan from the Singapore Botanical Garden. So then Kwek Yan will do a very short follow-up on Richard's presentation, trying to put the ideas that Richard present into a broader context, and then adding a bit of complexity to today's event. After that, so this will go for around 50 minutes. And after that, we'll have a Q&A. So then I will be moderating the Q&A. If you have questions, please we'll call for questions. Just let us know. You can either make your question directly or just write them in the chat box. So then without any further delay, please, Richard, you can start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ahimsa. As Ahimsa said, I'm talking about achieving zero extinction for land plants. I don't need to tell this audience, I hope, that plant diversity is essential for human well-being. It's not just that we eat plants, we wear plants, we use plants for medicine, for timber, for fiber, for all sorts of raw materials, but many of these uses are species specific. You can eat that plant, but you can't eat that plant. This plant cures you of disease, this plant kills you. Around a third of the Chinese flora, it's about more than 10,000 species, have known medicinal uses, and many other species have other uses. Plants also dominate the provision of essential ecosystem services, though these are not usually species specific, and plants have many other values. Also, they provide food and shelter for most terrestrial animals. Despite the importance of plants, recent estimates have suggested that between 21 and 44% of vascular plants, that's between 80,000 and 170,000 plant species, are threatened with extinction. Major threats are land use change, unsustainable harvesting, invasive pests and diseases, climate change, but there's other threats as well, such as pollution. In contrast to the estimates of 80 to 170,000 species threatened with extinction, fewer than 600 species are known to have become extinct in the last 250 years. This is certainly an underestimate. It's very difficult to know a plant is extinct. It could still be out there. It also ignores extinctions of species before they were described, so-called dark extinctions. But the difference is huge. And the big concern is the gap between predicted and observed extinctions represents an extinction debt that will be paid over future decades and centuries. So things may not look too bad now, but extinction will accelerate and eventually will pay off that huge debt. In response, there have been calls for preventing extinction of both plants and animals. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework, the GBF, is intended to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, number 15 includes halting biodiversity loss. More specifically, 4 years ago in XTBG, meeting on plant conservation ended with the Xishuangbanna Declaration on Plant Conservation, of which point 5, and this was from many of the world's leading botanists, heads of botanical gardens, seed banks, etc., noted that there was no technical reason why any plant species could go extinct, because we have lots of options for conservation, which are sufficient to conserve every known rare and threatened plant species. And considered, therefore, that the extinction of any known plant species is inexcusable. So, key points. We need plant diversity, but it's threatened, and there's no technical reason why any known plant species become extinct. Notice technical. There are good reasons, but they're not technical. It's not because it's impossible. I'd also add to this that plant conservation is much cheaper than animal conservation on a per species basis. Compare, say, the giant panda or Asian elephants or tigers with seeds in a seed bank. And costs per species decrease as additional species are conserved because existing facilities can be used. So the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK has 40,000 species, and adding another 50 species is not going to cost very much. So if zero plant extinction is both desirable and possible, why do plant extinctions still continue? What are the barriers to successful plant conservation? First is simply that plant conservation doesn't get enough support. You don't hear much about it unless you're a botanist. Plant conservation receives far less funding and other support than the conservation of animals, particularly charismatic vertebrates like the giant panda, but birds, mammals, even frogs, reptiles get more attention and more funding than plants. Another problem is the incomplete inventory. There are now 382,000 accepted species of vascular plants in the world flora online, but it's estimated an additional 10 to 25%, that's 40 to 95,000, are still undescribed. And if a species hasn't been described, it's invisible to science, and you can't plan for its conservation if you don't know what it is and where it is. Doesn't mean it's invisible to local people who may be using it or eating it or using it for medicine, but it's invisible to science and conservation planning. Currently, we're describing about 2,000 more species every year, but we need to accelerate this. New technologies can help, but the main bottleneck is still shortage of taxonomists, particularly in the tropics. I should mention here that taxonomists are not just describing new plants, but they also play critical roles in plant conservation in identifying plants. Otherwise, plant conservation just couldn't get done. Another barrier to plant conservation is the slow progress in conservation assessment for the IUCN Red Lists. Almost all vertebrates have now been assessed, all mammals, all birds, and the majority of reptiles and amphibians. Several other groups have been assessed, but only 15% of plant species have been assessed for the IUCN Red List. Now, in countries like China, national assessments fill gaps, but many species in China are still data deficient, so data deficient species also very difficult to conserve. It's possible to speed up conservation assessments by using open source data and machine learning, but unless you have location data available online, the accuracy of these automated assessments is going to be very low. So another major barrier to plant conservation is access to data. The most reliable location records come from herbarium specimens. Picture in the top right-hand corner is my space at Kew with a pile of herbarium specimens. The advantage of these for location records is that the identity can be checked. And there are estimated 400 million herbarium specimens in more than 3,500 herbaria in 183 countries. For conservation assessments, it's usually enough to have a scanned image plus transcribed label data, but only a few major herbaria have digitized all their specimens so far. Kew's in the middle of doing it. A lot of other herbaria are, but many herbaria have not got started, particularly in the tropics. Ideally, and this is going to happen within the next 5 years, 5 or 10 years, data from specimens will be linked in a global meta-herbarium to other relevant digital sources. Specimens, maps, photos, molecular sequence data, traits, habitats, uses, etc. And then you'll be able to access all this at one portal. The World Flora Online is a good start for this, but we've got a long way to go to get all this data digitized, checked, and online. Data that's available online is a good thing if it's good data. But most users of this data cannot check themselves. You can't go out and check that the location's correct, that the identity of the specimen's correct, unless you're an expert on that group. And there's a lot of bad data online. Anyone who's used GBIF data will know. You end up with your plant in the middle of the sea, or in habitats it doesn't occur, or way outside its range, and you don't know if that's a real record, or maybe it's in someone's back garden, or maybe it was misidentified. So wrong identifications, wrongly transcribed locations, there's a lot of bad data, and this is a real problem. In some tropical herbaria, it's been estimated that half the specimens are misidentified or not identified at all. Machine learning can automate checks if you've scanned your specimens, but you need enough training data to do this. And for rare species, there's never enough training data. And you need a human expert for final checks. For some purposes, such as regional conservation planning, quantity of data may compensate for quality. In these cases, citizen science data with automated check-in can be a useful way of filling data gaps. You still need some expert supervision, but you can expand the reach of a single expert. For example, iNaturalist has more than 50 million observations of 141,000 plant species. So that's about 40% of the global flora has been observed by citizen scientists on iNaturalist. And of these 50 million observations, 29 million are so-called research grade, meaning that they've been checked by other online users of iNaturalist. And you can check them further. Okay, so those are the main barriers. How do we overcome them? How do we actually conserve plant species in practice? How do we achieve zero extinction? First of all, we need to decide what we're going to conserve. Most data is available at the species level, but as a lot of you who are listening will know, this is often not the best level for conservation in plants. There's often significant gene flow between species and significant barriers to gene flow within species. Moreover, widespread species, each population very often shows local adaptation to climate or to soil or to other factors. This means you can't just conserve one population of a species, you have to conserve multiple populations across the full morphological, geographical, and ecological range of the species. This obviously increases the task. We've got 382,000 species, many of them least concern, so we don't need to worry about them, but we've still got a lot of species to conserve. Multiple populations of each obviously increases the amount that needs to be done. Briefly mention, obviously genetic information can help here, but the spatial structure detected with neutral markers, which is what's usually used when looking at spatial patterns of genetic variation, doesn't necessarily represent or even correlate with local adaptation. And it's really local adaptation that we're interested in. We're interested in plant populations which are adapted to particular local conditions. Ideally, plants will be conserved in their natural habitat because wild populations can continue to evolve in response to environmental change. They can adapt to new pests and diseases, to climate change, possibly if they can evolve fast enough, other changes. Moreover, a wild population of a plant can continue to support populations of mutualists, of herbivores and pathogens, some of which have no alternative host. If a plant becomes extinct in the wild, then its herbivores and pathogens, if they're specialists, are likely to become extinct too. Unfortunately, although we have now about somewhere between 15 and 20% of the Earth's surface is protected, and we've just agreed in last December to extend that to 30%, and Stuart Pym is going to tell us in a couple of months why that's not enough or too much. protected areas are usually chosen to conserve animals. So protected area systems often provide poor coverage for plants. This varies between countries, but I think it's true in China that the protected area system is optimized for animals. The Important Plant Area Programme aims to counteract this bias, but so far it only covers a few countries, mostly in Europe. Establishing new protected areas is difficult, and the cost of a new protected area are borne disproportionately by local people who lose access to the land, access to the resources. But for plants, often micro-reserves, less than 50 hectares, can be effective for narrow-range endemic species or small populations, and they minimize these costs. So the slide is a micro-reserve in Valencia in Spain, which I think originated this micro-reserve system. But there's now thousands of micro-reserves across the world, including in China. Finally, I must emphasize that in situ conservation, that the presence of a species inside a protected area does not mean it's secure. Conservation requires a viable population that persists over time, or a non-viable population that recovers. So you need long-term monitoring of species in protected areas. And in many cases, there's going to be species-specific management interventions. And it's these management interventions that are often lacking in protected areas. These may mean restoring habitat, controlling competitors or pests and diseases, managing fires, reinforcing the population if it's declining, all sorts of possibilities. We need ex situ conservation. That's conservation outside the natural habitat as backup for wild populations under continued threat. So basically any species which is under threat under IUCN Red List assessment should have backup ex situ populations. These can also be used for research, education, and restoration, but I'm talking here about conservation. Almost a third of plant species are in living collections in botanical gardens. But in most cases, these are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 individuals, and if there's 5, they may well have been cloned. So they're not genetically representative of the wild populations. And you couldn't reintroduce a species to the wild using these living collections. In order to maintain larger living, we need to perhaps also use public green spaces, such as roadsides and urban parks. So that pictures a park in Shanghai, and those trees are probably cloned exotics, but they don't need to be. They could be genetically diverse native species. Living collections have other problems. They're subject to unintentional selection for survival and cultivation. For instance, seed dormancy. So those palm trees at XTBG, they represent the ones where the seeds germinated. If the seeds didn't germinate or were going to take a long time to germinate, their genes aren't passed on. And what happens with long-term multi-generation conservation botanical gardens in the temperate zone is that seed dormancy tends to be lost. Lots of other changes as well. We also get inbreeding and genetic drift in small populations. And if species are grown with related species, you get hybridization and integration. And this is particularly true if plants are cultivated for multiple generations in botanical gardens. Ideally, each generation you should collect again from the wild if it's still possible. Fortunately, for most plant species, probably 75–80%, seeds can be stored under standard conditions in seed banks. This is a very cheap way of storing many genetic individuals in a small space. So that's seed bank in Kunming, and each of those jars has hundreds of genetic individuals of a plant species, which will remain viable, hopefully, for decades or longer. Unfortunately, there's wide variation in seed longevity in seed banks. And some species which survive drying and survive freezing then die over a few years in a seed bank. And this is a major problem. Also, at least 10% of plant species have desiccation-sensitive seeds, so you can't dry them and you can't freeze them, and they can't be stored in seed banks. Sorry. For decades, crop plants with seeds that are short-lived in seed banks or desiccation-sensitive or just hard to germinate have been stored in cryobanks, usually in or over liquid nitrogen. This is now being increasingly used for wild species, but unfortunately, unlike seed banks with standard seeds, there's no standard protocol, and species-specific methods can be expensive to develop. But once you've developed a method, long-term storage is cheap. You've just got to keep topping up the liquid nitrogen. Or you can use an ultra-low temperature refrigerator. Ideally, you'd store seeds because they're easy to germinate, but in many cases you can't, and instead you freeze embryos or shoot tips or other tissues. Valerie Pence at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens, who was at XTBG in January 2019, has developed this exceptional plant conservation network, exceptional plants, these where you can't store their seeds in seed banks, which is promoting the use of cryobiotechnology for long-term conservation of plants ex situ. Briefly, I can mention ex situ collections can be used in habitat restoration, though ideally you need a proper restoration seed bank because most ex situ collections for conservation don't have enough seeds, while you need millions of seeds for restoration. They're also used for reintroductions, for reinforcements of declining populations, or for assisted gene flow. You could introduce better adapted genotypes into a wild population. Now, unless a species has multiple secure wild populations, it's going to need an integrated conservation program involving both in and ex situ approaches based on individual species recovery plans. So every threatened species, so that's every species that's rated as vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, or extinct in the wild, needs an individual species recovery plan. And most threatened species, this plan will include both the protection and management of remaining wild populations, plus ex situ living collections, which are useful for research and education, plus, if possible, genetically representative collections in seed banks or cryobanks. So these various forms of conservation have different purposes. The wild populations continue to evolve, continue to support mutualists, pests and pathogens. The living collections are useful for research and an ultimate backup because you can have a living collection of anything. And seed banks and cryobanks basically to have genetically representative collections of many different populations. Okay, I'm actually being faster than I expected. I cut out quite a lot this morning because I thought I was going to go too slowly. But anyway, I've still got a few more slides to go. There's no technical reason why any known plant species should go extinct, meaning for every plant that we know, we can work out a way of conserving it. Maybe we have to grow it in the garden, maybe we have to use tissue culture, maybe we have to protect it in the wild. Hopefully its seeds can go in a seed bank, or we can work out a cryopreservation protocol. Won't necessarily be easy, but it's doable. However, plant conservation is undervalued and underfunded. Too many species are undescribed, perhaps as many as 15–25% of the species, and too few species have had a conservation assessment. The major bottlenecks, however, reflect a shortage of skilled people. There just aren't enough plant collectors, taxonomists, horticulturalists, particularly in the tropics. But this is in fact true worldwide. In Europe, we're also short of people with the necessary skills. We need more research on cryobanking. We need to develop a small set of standard protocols that will work for everything. We can't, for thousands of species, develop separate protocols and then carry them out. So we have to do more work on cryobanking. But in general, research gaps are generally less important than implementation gaps. If we implement what we already know, which is protection in the wild, living collections, and seed banks, we can save the great majority of plant species. Okay, I just want to finish by mentioning some things that are working globally. One of the most important developments in the last few years, led by BGCI, has been these global conservation consortia. Some of you are probably involved in them. There's ones for Acer, for Carpaceae, Magnolia, Notophagus, Quercus, Rhododendron. There's a whole lot of other ones getting going. And there's many other genera and families suitable for this approach. So if you're a specialist on a genus or family in China, get together with people around the world, talk to BDCI, and set up a global conservation consortium. Because if you focus on one particular group of plants, you can share ideas, you can share cryobanking protocols if it's Quercus or Magnolia, which you can't store in, or Dipterocarps, which you can't store in standard seed banks. You can share plants across gardens, a whole lot. These seem to be a very effective way of plant conservation. Two examples which I think XTBG were involved in the Dipterocarp one, I see UN Bin's name at the end of the list. I think there's a couple of other XTBG people involved in that. Certainly XTBG contributed information to the Magnoliaceae one. BGCI is also responsible for the global tree assessment, which is doing red list assessments for all the 50–60,000 global tree species, which is a major gap because most of the red list assessments have not been for trees, and trees are most threatened. So that's another major project. And then the World Flora Online, which will form the basis of this global meta-herbarium, linking together all the information we have on each plant species. And I hope that when all this information is linked together, then we'll start valuing plants as much as we should. Okay, thank you very much. This work formed the basis for a paper which is in Trends in Plant Science. I hope it would have been published by today or be online, but it isn't yet. So if you want to get a copy, I'll send you one if you email me as soon as it's available. I think that's all I should say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I just want to remind people that Richard published a related paper in our December issue in Integrative Conservation, where he was talking about how to centralize information and the taxonomic gaps they need to describe all these undescribed species. And now we'll hear from Dr. Chong, Kwek Yan, who's a senior researcher at the Singapore Botanical Garden. He works on a long-term project monitoring vegetation plots in Singapore, and he will add his perspective on this topic. So, Kwek Yan, all yours.
Hey, thanks, Ahimsa. Thanks for inviting me to be the respondent to Richard's webinar. And in the past, I've worked with Richard when he spent a few years in Singapore. In fact, twice he was in Singapore for a few years. And so, it's always good to hear from Richard again and to listen to him talk. So what I would do is basically give some reflections on what Richard has said from my perspective, mostly from my experience working in Singapore in plant ecology and conservation in Singapore. So Richard's presentation has examined the premise that there is no reason why zero plant extinctions are not possible, given that many plants can be propagated from a single or maybe a few individuals, and at the very least can be conserved ex situ in living collections, and if not in situ. And genetic diversity even can be safeguarded with approaches such as seed banking. So the conclusion is that while there may be some technical problems, but these are not unsurmountable technical or scientific problems. So if we go back to the original question behind Richard's webinar, why then do plants still go extinct? Or perhaps if we phrase it to be more forward-looking, why will plants continue to go extinct, and how can we still fail to achieve zero plant extinctions? I think at the end of the day, my takeaway from listening to Richard and also from what I've been thinking is that at the end of the day, the answer will almost certainly boil down to a resourcing problem. And the first resource problem that which Richard has also mentioned is a manpower problem. Often this comes as a lament that there are not enough plant taxonomists, we need more plant taxonomists. And I certainly don't disagree with this. And if the target for zero extinctions of taxa, such as species, subspecies, varieties, and so on, then we actually need to delimit what these are, and which necessarily involve the use of taxonomy. So this gap in taxonomic delimitation to meet our needs is the so-called Linnaean shortfall. And at first glance, at least in proportional terms, actually plants appear to be in a much better position than many, for example, invertebrate groups. Usually global level conservation or climate targets appear doomed to failure, and revisions of these targets are simply followed by repeated failures. But for the global strategy for plant conservation, target 1, this is one of the few examples of global level targets that have been met. And this was met first with the creation of a working list of all plant species, and subsequently when this target was revised and upgraded to a more ambitious target of a world flora, yet this is still considered to be being met and now awaiting yet another upgraded target. But in absolute terms, because there are an estimated about close to 400,000 plant species, even an annual rate of discovery of just 0.5% means that there are a couple of thousand species added per year. Beyond species discovery, however, there's also the clarification of misapplied names, synonyms, and so on. And all these are the work of taxonomists that are important to conservation. Without taxonomic clarity, assessments of extinction risks and their threats, they are either impossible or they are at risk of being muddled. And without these assessments, conservation actions risk being inefficient or misdirected. So the key step in this process, taxonomy, requires taxonomies. So taking the example of where I am from, the first checklist of Singapore's vascular plants was published in 1900, which was 123 years ago. I'm based at the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and it is an institution where a few of the region's most important botanists were based during Singapore's colonial era in the early 20th century, the 19th to the earlier 20th century. So Singapore is probably the most densely collected country in the world, with the last tally giving that we have more than 5,000 botanical collections per 100 square kilometers. So one might think that there are no more plants to discover in small, tiny little Singapore, especially by the time of the middle of the last century. 99% of the original forest cover was already lost. And even today, only about 5% or so of the land cover is actually good quality forest, which however, includes secondary forests. And yet, as a result of recent acceleration in investment into taxonomic research, more than 100 species have been added to the flora just in the last 14 to 15 years. And in at least 2 of these cases, I can recall offhand, what was thought to be 1 species was clarified to be 4 or even 6 species, and some even effectively endemic to tiny Singapore because it's not known anywhere else. And therefore, these species now become conservation priorities to prevent their global extinction. However, I think one of the points that Richard makes, I would like to elaborate further, is that it's not really just the plant taxonomists that are needed, but also skilled workers in all other aspects of plant conservation. Field botanists that collect the plants and fill in the valuation shortfall of what plants occur where, so that in situ conservation plans can be better updated to better reflect and incorporate the spatial distributions of the plants that are most at risk of extinction. These field botanists need not necessarily be taxonomists in the sense of being able to delineate species, but they have the ability to make the correct identifications in the field. They have a sense of what might be an important or even an unknown species. They are the ones providing the primary information and material for the taxonomist colleagues and vastly expand their reach. So we talk about extended herbarium specimens. Field botanists who are not taxonomists are extended taxonomists or para-taxonomists. They also provide insights and best guess estimates to address yet another shortfall, which is the Prestonian shortfall of what are the population sizes of the species out there, whether these populations are in decline. These people might be plant ecologists like myself, managers or rangers of national parks and nature reserves, foresters, consultants, or even plant enthusiasts and citizen scientists who contribute, for example, to iNaturalist. Then even if we address the Linnaean, Wallacean, and Prestonian shortfalls to be able to know all the plant species out there, we assess all of them, from the sheer volume alone, we are faced with another challenge. If just 20% or a fifth of the 400,000 plant species are threatened, which is the lower bound estimate that Richard cited, then this will still be 80,000 species to consider conservation actions for. If it were 30%, then it would be some 120,000 species. We will need enough horticulturists to know how to propagate the plants that they have probably never seen before. And we need the plant geneticists and so on, who will be able to deal with this vast diversity of species. But of course, as Richard said, sharing of expertise, focusing on various groups and forming these work groups is perhaps one way to deal with this problem. But the sheer volume is not just at the global level, but it's also at the local level. For example, in Singapore, we have more than 2,300 land plant species, and sorry, even more than that for land plant species. 2,300 is vascular plant species, and this is far greater than any of the other taxonomic groups that are being assessed by the upcoming 3rd edition of our National Red Data Book, which would then present more problems in the number of species that are in the number of plant species that are in our nation's species recovery plan far outweighs the number of animal species. So where would these skilled botanists beyond just the plant taxonomists come from? Unfortunately, the emphasis on botany and horticulture in universities around the world, whether in the developed world or in the developing world, is declining, and this needs to be addressed perhaps by reconsidering who should be training the next generation of botanists. Again, taking the example of where I come from, originally the center of gravity for botanical expertise during the colonial days was in the Singapore Botanic Gardens, which was under the colonial government. But after Singapore became independent and a country on its own right, the center of gravity for botany actually shifted to academia, to the universities. But in recent decades, departments in the universities were merged and the number of botanists and botany courses in the university have dropped. On the other hand, the Singapore Botanic Gardens built up its botanical research again in recent decades. And the Gardens is part of the National Parks Board, which is a statutory agency that is in charge of maintaining the greenery in the parks and the nature reserves of Singapore. And given that we are becoming increasingly worried about the prospects of future fresh graduates, which we have to consider as potential employees, they will know less and less about the plants that they have to manage. Since last year, the Botanic Gardens has been partnering with the university to teach a whole undergraduate final year course on the plant diversity of Southeast Asia. And this year, the university will launch a new minor in botany co-designed with the garden staff. And this may be the way to go, where publicly funded institutes actually have a different remits and different mandates that is not under the same kind of pressures of the typical market forces in academia. And these public funded institutes may have to pick up the tab and support the training of future botanists. Lastly, beyond manpower, land, funds, resources in general are just needed to build seed banks, cryogenic facilities, fund collection trips, digitize specimens, maintain databases, and run tests. On a per species basis, plants are cheaper, and I completely agree with Richard. But it is really the sheer volume that is the problem, given the total number of plant species in general. And all these demands for conservation resources are competing with the rest of the economy. And this is one of the wicked problems in any part of conservation. I agree with Richard that plants, together with fungi, invertebrates, we face more challenges in trying to attract conservation attention. And part of the invisibility that Richard mentioned is attributed to plant blindness, fungi blindness, invertebrate blindness. And it's perhaps because we are psychologically or culturally predisposed to ignore what is unlike us and treat them as part of the background. And this is perhaps where I would actually end my response to Richard's talk with a question to Richard. Richard, have you any thoughts, given your years of experience, how can this fundamental problem of a lack of social, cultural, political interest and support for plant conservation can be addressed? Perhaps you do, I'm not sure whether you completely agree with this, but is it beyond just perhaps changes to the education system and so on? Do you have any other thoughts on how this aspect can be integrated into conservation efforts overall? Yeah.
Sir, can I answer that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I've worried about this for 40 years, and you were one of my successes, I think, since you probably attended my lectures. I don't know. I really don't know. I write books. I run training courses. Field courses are the most successful way we've ever found of teaching people. But that can produce a few specialists who go on to academic positions, but all the other need for botanical knowledge that you mentioned, I don't know. I do hope that when all this plant information becomes available, and if the World Flora Online, for instance, has a user-friendly interface where you can search in your national language for plants and find information, which it will eventually, then this may spark a revival of plant knowledge. I really don't know. In Britain, it's the amount of knowledge of plants has declined dramatically over the last 150 years.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so then you want to say something else about that, Kwek Yan?
Yeah, I completely agree. Maybe it was a bit of it's a question, I mean, just to see if Richard had any thoughts on that. But given that it is a wicked problem, it is a problem that doesn't have any simple solutions. And I agree, I mean, for us who are involved in education and not just research, I think there is the joy of teaching students who are just slightly interested and see them becoming even more interested in plants. And hopefully we will be able to extend this reach broader. But it's a bit of a swimming against the tide in some senses. But I guess that, the only way to go on is just to continue to persist here.
Okay, thank you both of you. It has been really interesting. Of course, which are very comprehensive and very, very kind of global addressing of this issue. And I think, Kwek Yan, you added very, very interesting specific points. I have been hearing from Richard for a few years this concept that there is no technical reason why plants should go extinct. It took some time for me to permeate. I mean, it's the idea that actually, that in theory, it's possible to prevent extinctions, maybe not 100%, but in almost, not too far away from having no extinctions. But of course, I assume that we agree there's a big gap from something not going extinct to something being effectively conserved. I mean, it's kind of a minimum point, having species represented in an ex situ collection is not extinct, but it's not being part of an ecosystem, it's not bringing ecosystem function, ecosystem services. So I guess that will be a different discussion, right? It's kind of just the beginning.
I mean, yes, certainly. And if I had another 10 minutes to talk, I'd probably have talked more about restoration. I actually cut this out. But I mean, I think the task for now is prevent an extinction. I mean, I think this applies to animals too, that if we don't prevent extinction of, say, the Javan rhino, then any possible future of the Javan rhino is gone, and we've lost 30,000 years of evolution. So now the Javan rhino is going to be, or the Sumatran rhino even worse, it's going to be amazingly difficult to save. But if we had one Sumatran rhino left and it was a plant, we could certainly take cuttings or tissue culture from it, or take tissues and freeze them. Well, we could take tissues already with the Sumatran rhino, but so there's just a lot more options for plants. And if you talk to a skilled horticulturalist, given time, space, and resources, they can get anything to grow. But we don't have enough of those.
And one of the key things that I wanted to ask you, and Kwek Yan has already kind of followed up with very, very specific suggestions, is institutional changes that are needed to create these botanists or to have these people who can do the work. And I think one of the points that you made, Kwek Yan, is that it doesn't need to be an academic job. So in academia, the incentives is to produce papers, and there are a number of requirements that are not compatible with the goal of having a better taxonomical knowledge, right? So then I think moving away this role from academia into the institutions will be the most sensible thing to be effective and to make it work.
Well, I can say some of that. I mean, I agree with Kwek Yan. It needs to be, I mean, that's the great thing, this new course in Singapore, it's both. So if you move it entirely to institutions, then it'll get killed off in government funding cuts. I mean, universities have a degree of autonomy. Even the great botanical gardens, well, XTBG, Kew, Edinburgh, don't have a huge pile of money that will keep them going forever. They have to justify themselves every year. And there's always the risk of cuts. And the Singapore Botanic Gardens has sort of gone up and down over its history, depending on how seriously the government and the relevant minister has taken it. And that's been true of all of them. So you do need both. But it's not just the university level. It's botany's gone out of lower levels as well, primary and secondary schools.
Yeah, and I wanted to have some question about assessment, evaluation of the status of the populations or the species. And I know you often talk about the artificial intelligence and the potential of doing this kind of AI-based assessments. How positive are you about this in terms of being effective, in terms of being available very soon, and whether it's really a very good way to go to have just machines doing tens of thousands of assessments on a continuous update, or you think that is a dangerous way to go?
No, I don't think that's far away, and it's not dangerous. I mean, I think for a long time you're going to need expert checks, but relatively, I mean, if you have iNaturalist, well, I mean, whatever you have on Chinese apps on your phone, you can identify plants pretty well all over China using machine learning. And using this and flagging things that the program's not sure about and having them checked by an expert can, I think, massively increase the reach of an expert. The last 3 years have just seen fantastic developments in this, and I think the next 2 or 3 years this will become not only practical but just absolutely standard. But you need the training data, and currently, majority of plants, there aren't plant species, there aren't even photographs available online. And even if there's one herbarium specimen online, training a program to recognize a brown flat specimen and then go out and see the thing in the field. A skilled taxonomist can do that, but it's beyond AI for many years.
So my last question is to Kwek Yan. Besides having evaluation based on available data, can we have a AI taxonomist? It's going to happen soon. That will be just AI that will be identifying whether it's a new taxa and will be doing all that without much supervision by human experts.
Yeah, I think there's been a few papers about scanning herbarium specimen, and given that these are all herbarium specimens that have been already determined by experts, and this immediately forms the kind of training data that can be used to train these AI algorithms. But I would also want to add that perhaps even beyond just about delimiting species or recognizing species in the field, I think AI perhaps is already being, and AI and machine learning is already being used in ways that will feed into conservation assessments. For example, now there's a lot of research into seeing whether these machine learning or deep learning approaches can predict community or population dynamics. And that has been, for example, criteria E in the IUCN criteria has always been one of the hardest criteria to actually assess species for. But if we are able to develop these algorithms, maybe they are black box algorithms, maybe we don't have a mechanistic ecological understanding of the underlying processes behind it. But if their predictive power is able to be such that you can feed scenarios into these algorithms and they can generate probabilities of extinction, then we would perhaps be able to, by collating data from a lot of long-term plots, long-term monitoring, long-term population monitoring, we will be able to parameterize these models and apply it to other species and very rapidly do assessments, perhaps using the gold standard of criteria E, for example. Just one thought from me.
Yeah, I guess one of the good things that these models will improve cumulatively. So then, the first versions will be very limited, but as you continue adding data and improving the models, in a matter of a few decades, they will work much better. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are now opening the questions. Yeah, do you want to do that, please? We open the questions to the floor. So then, please just let us know if you have any question.
Ahimsa.
Yeah,
Ahimsa, sorry. I suggest maybe you can read, or Richard can read the question that are in the box and start with those.
Sure. Yeah, I will do that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so
you mean in the chat box?
Yes,
because Richard, we have several platforms, and I think the questions we answer here are being seen only for a few of the people who are online. So let's read them, so everyone can see the question and the answer. So we have one question from Chan Chihan from the Chinese Academy of Forestry. And the question is the ultra-dry treatment still the fashion way in germs plant conservation? And Richard has answered it here, but if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I replied to this in the chat, but for those of you who don't have access to it, yes, I mean, if you can dry seeds and freeze them, it's cheap, quick and easy, and it's standard. And the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK has 40,000 species, including the entire UK flora, except for a few species with seeds that die when you dry, like oaks, which unfortunately are important for forestry. So seed banks are always the first choice when you're dealing with plants. If you can use seed banks, because they're cheap. But if they aren't, then you have to go for living collections or cryobiotechnology.
And Professor Chen Jin from XTBG was saying that 600 species extinct in the past 150 years, even though it might be an underestimate, it doesn't seem to be a very big deal. The point, however, is how plant extinction responds to the coming climate change compared with other groups like invertebrates and so on will be, and is any estimate about what to expect?
No, I mean, okay, there are estimates, but they're not robust. And my student did one for Thailand. As far as I know, there is no example, robust example of a plant species become extinct because of climate change, because of modern climate change. And even throughout Pleistocene climate changes in the Northern Hemisphere, I think there's only one known extinction in North America. Now, obviously, we don't have good enough records to know that there weren't more extinctions. So it's possible that plant populations are just, and plants are just a lot tougher than we know, than we've assumed. But I think it's largely because plants are long-lived. Outside the tropics, many of them have seed banks, and even a suppressed seedling or a plant that's been harvested, chopped down for firewood or something may still be alive and still resprout. You can't sort of chop bits off an elephant and have it still live, but you can with plants, and pandas don't have seeds. So no, there are no reliable estimates. You can use the methods we did for Thailand and use it for vertebrates and insects and plants, just based on where the plants will be within their climate, their existing climate envelope, 30 years and 50 years in the future. And those give you very high extinction rates, but we're not seeing those yet. We've had 1 degree of warming. So they're either happening very slowly or they're not happening, and plants are adapting.
Richard, if I may ask you a question. So there have been some estimates from the fossil record that seems to suggest that plants have actually a pretty low background extinction rate compared to other taxa. I don't know if you know of this, and if you think that that may perhaps suggest to us that plants might actually be quite robust, I mean, comparatively robust to extinction compared to other groups.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly the mass extinctions at the beginning of the tertiary, I mean, 66 million years ago, every animal over about cat size became extinct, but a lot of plants went through that. So yes, plants are tough, and you can imagine a meteorite strike and everything above ground being destroyed, and then at least some of the trees resprouting from roots a meter below ground where they might be protected. So yes, I wouldn't want to rely on this though, because obviously the modern world is very, very different. Natural ecosystems are massively fragmented, and we have all these pressures on things together. So I don't know. I'm actually, I guess I'm agnostic on this. I just don't know whether we're going to see mass plant extinctions or not. But I think we should target 0.
Thank you. We have a question from Musa, who is a postdoc in XTVG. And then he says that he knows there are different factors like habitat loss and overharvesting that drive species extinction. But which of these factors do you think are most having the strongest effect on plant extinction these days? And second, a very challenging question: what can researchers do to contribute to prevent plant extinctions?
If you look at known plant extinctions, and we've got so few to look at that people, rather than looking at the 570 known plant extinctions, tend to look at the tens of thousands of critically endangered plants on the theory that they're going to go extinct too, and we can look at those instead. But habitat loss and overharvesting are the major the major two causes. So there's relatively few, I don't know, there's any plants definitely killed by climate change within the last 250 years, which we have records. And there's certainly plants which are critically endangered as a result of disease, but I don't know of any of extinctions yet. Currently in various parts of the world, particularly in Australia, there's a disease, Phytophthora disease, I think, moving through the Myrtaceae, threatening to wipe out dozens of species, but none are extinct yet, and it's not clear whether it'll cause extinction or just massive declines in populations. Climate change, I've just talked about. Invasive species, competition, cause local extinction. I don't know of an example of global extinction.
And what can researchers do to help to prevent this?
I mean, it's, I suggested cryobanking as something where, for instance, in Xishuangbanna, you could get an estimate from the seed bank, but I think about a third or perhaps a quarter of the species in Xishuangbanna have recalcitrant seeds, and developing cryopreservation protocols for them would be a very useful contribution to preventing plant extinction. But I'm not sure that, well, I've said already that there are research gaps, clearly, but I think what we need to do is go ahead with implementation, and then when we're having difficulty with a particular species, then we have to apply whatever techniques are most appropriate. I'm afraid simply, it's difficult to do a PhD on plant conservation.
Yeah, Kwek Yan, you have anything to add?
No, I think that's true. Yeah. I think Richard has said it all.
Yeah. Anytime if you want to say anything, yes, please step in. So we have a question from Tibor Drost. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, from the Wuhan Botanical Garden. And the question is, how can public education at botanical gardens contribute to achieving zero extinction of land plants? And what might be the priorities for that type of public education?
That's a very good question. It's one I wish I'd thought about before you asked it. I mean, obviously, I thought about this having worked at XTBG for 9 years. And I think the answer has to be to infuse everything that the garden does in public education with conservation. And particularly, so XTBG, when I left it, maybe the signs have changed, but a lot of the signage in XTBG doesn't actually tell you about conservation issues. It tells you other things about the plant collection. So you can go and look at the palm collection and you will know that it's one of the biggest palm collections in the world, and palms are very interesting plants. But it would be good to have there some in the signs, or perhaps in a phone app, which when you point at a particular species, giving you information on plant conservation. So XTBG and many other gardens highlight endangered species with particular labels. So some gardens don't do this because people then steal the plants. And you could then have, say, a phone app which provided more information. I think it has to be diffused through everything you do. I think for a public education of botanical garden has to be conservation education. I don't think, but it can be through food. Kew Gardens, where I'm now a research fellow, has a big emphasis on food. If you eat meals in the canteen, you learn about the plants you're eating, and it can be done. You can learn about coffee, for instance, if you buy a cup of coffee. Conservation needs to be in everything. There's no other justification for having botanical gardens. Don't necessarily quote me on that.
So just to jump in, I think it's really the same case for the Singapore Botanic Gardens here. I mean, at risk of appearing like, you know, I'm a spokesperson for the gardens or something, which I'm not, but the gardens has a branch which actually is an education branch, and they do workshops for children as well as adults. I think during the pandemic period, they were very restricted in the kind of activities they could do, but now they're ramping it back up again. And our boss, Richard, you will know him. Poyok is our boss, and he also says the same thing as what you have said, that environmental sustainability and conservation is at the heart of what the gardens do. And the botanic gardens should be just like what zoos are for animal conservation, isn't it? People go to the zoos, children go to the zoos, and in a sense, the Singapore Zoological Gardens or Singapore Zoo has done a great job in this regard, where, like what you mentioned, Richard, there's lots of signages that talk about the conservation of these animals. And maybe this is the kind of thing that botanic gardens really should do, and to infuse conservation messaging into the gardens operations, just like the zoos are nowadays moving towards, and that helps in animal conservation.
Yeah, I like that, and I visit very often Singapore Zoo, and I like to go both as a professional, but also as a visitor, as a tourist, because they have professional people scripting the text that will be done in the education and the entertainment. Is very well combined. So in a way that it's enjoyable and it's informative. So when people have a good experience, but they come out with good knowledge. There's information that is relevant, and is transmitted in a very enjoyable way. It's with humor, with fun facts, and attractive to children. So I think that's a very important part of conveying the message effectively. We have a question from Liu Yingxing, also from XTVG. And he's asking about, we said that there are so many specimens to be identified in the tropics. So again, he means quality specimens that remain to be properly identified or re-identified. So why to continue funding so much new field collections? So then we be emphasizing more the IDN process, and maybe putting more resources in this process.
Yeah, I mean, we need to fund field activities, because if you don't do them now, the habitat may have gone, and it's then too late to do them in the future. But I agree that for many tropical herbaria, and probably some outside the tropics, funding people to come and look through particular families and check specimens' identities is likely to be more valuable. And in fact, you can find more species, more new species in tropical herbaria per sort of week than you're likely to find the same amount of time in the field. So, but you do need to do both. And certainly all the major botanical gardens do see cooperating with countries, particularly in the tropics with fewer resources, a major part of what they do. And I work in the Kew Herbarium, and probably 70% of the people working in the herbarium, which is one of the best in the world, are African students, postdocs, researchers, who Kew supports, funds from overseas development funds, actually. It's not from Kew's own budget. And I know Edinburgh does the same. XTBEG has run training courses on plant identification in Myanmar, in Laos. So it is being done, but we can't, unfortunately, just stop and catch up with identification because we're going to be losing stuff. We need more people.
Yeah, I agree with Richard that it's not a matter of stopping or allocating all the funding towards identification and stopping field collections. I think field collections has to continue. I think maybe a broader question beyond that is how do we make this flow, how do we make this support and resourcing for both field collection as well as identification of specimens in tropical herbaria, tropical organizations? How can we make it more sustainable rather than always, perhaps resources flowing from developed countries to developing countries, or younger botanists from developing countries going over to developed countries to learn and train? But how do we also create other kinds of conditions such as these botanists, so that these botanists actually have a career in front of them to spend more time and protect their time so that they can continue to do field collections and identifications and also train their own people in their own countries? I think this is probably one of the maybe more cost-effective way of tackling this problem rather than perhaps reallocating the resources from field collections to identification.
We have a question from Romy Manage Goodell from Xishuangbanna Liverpool University. How can we separate these species that may go naturally extinct from those that are anthropogenically driven to prioritize conservation? So, there will be some natural extinctions. How can we distinguish these two different processes?
I mean, I think we can do it easily because the natural extinction rate for plants has been estimated about one species in a million every year. But that could be right by several orders of magnitude. So that's basically with 400,000 land plants. So that's one land plant species every year, while human extinctions vastly exceed that. I don't think there's any possible way that you could distinguish a natural extinction. And I don't think we'd want to, because if we saw a species and we could prove it was about to go naturally extinct, would we not conserve it? I'd conserve it. The future's unknown, and the species which goes naturally extinct now may be better adapted to the future. But I think natural extinctions will be sufficiently low that we don't have to worry about them for plants. It has been proposed, and it was proposed as part of the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, that rather than aiming to halt extinctions, we should try and reduce extinctions to the natural level. But for animals, it's equally so. Maybe we should have 20 natural animal extinctions a year, but we don't know which ones they are, and if we had the choice, we'd still protect them.
And then we have two questions from Wang Gang, also from XTBG. And then what he's saying is that the extinction might be just what we have to face. They say we face hunger and wars and human suffering in many ways. And then it might be just too difficult to allocate the resources to achieve zero plant extinction. So maybe some plant extinction will happen anyway. But the question is there any novel strategy for plant conservation, not just stopping them from extinction, but maybe increasing their adaptation to a changing environment?
Yeah, I mean, in my paper, I do talk about this. I mean, I give a reference, so I didn't have time really to cover it. I think that the immediate task is preventing plant extinction. And given that preventing plant extinction is doable and cheap. It's not as if I agree that preventing some animal extinctions has turned out to be incredibly expensive. I mean, it costs millions and millions of US dollars, but there's no plant for which that's true. So we can prevent plant extinctions with a very small proportion of human resources. And we're not taking away resources from anything else. So I think our immediate task is preventing plant extinction. For adaptation for climate change, then accelerated gene flow, there's all sorts of things on this. And there's now quite a big literature on this. And I suggested briefly in one slide that one of the uses for ex situ collections would be introducing sort of warmth adapted populations into declining cold adapted populations to help them adapt. And I think this sort of thing may be worth doing, but we're never going to be able to do that sort of thing for more than a few species, while we can save all species from plant extinction.
Richard, I'm wondering whether I could stir the pot a bit and ask you about zero extinctions in terms of genetic extinctions. So we've been talking about zero extinction in terms of species or taxa, right? But so do you think that given that there's going to be some genes which will be maladapted to our coming future, that zero extinction in terms of alleles is not going to be even possible? Maybe even 90% chance of securing alleles is also not going to be possible.
No, I mean, that's a very good question. And it's one that I actually totally cut out of my talk and the paper, because there isn't anything really sensible to say about it. I mean, if you look at the plants in your background, which possibly you can't see, even plants of the same individuals they're different. Every plant's different. If it's an outbreeding species, every individual's different. So zero extinction, we should save every individual, not just every species. Or maybe we could go for 95% of alleles, but alleles are a human concept. We really want 90% of the entire genome sequence. Or I don't know how we'd do it, but that would include both. Basically, it just gets too complicated. So I would go for populations spread across the morphological, ecological, genetic, geographical range of a species. Species are real in a sense. I know botanists like to say that species aren't real, but if you work as an ecologist, as I did for most of my life, species are real. There are, some species are realer than others, but so we need multiple populations, but we don't need to save every individual. I don't think targets like 95% of alleles make a huge amount of sense because they're very dependent on what technique you've used.
And Wang had a second question that has been touched already in a previous answer. I think maybe there's room for more. It's about how to deal with gene flow on plant conservation, because the gene flow can lead to genetic pollution, but also genetic novelty for adaptation, and then how to improve this in ex situ conservation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that in my review paper I deal with by giving references because it's a very complicated issue. And I think we need to do some experiments on this now in case we need to use this technique in future. It's not clear how plants are responding to climate change. I wrote a review of this years ago, and it's not any clearer now. In many ways, it's less clear. Some species are migrating in response to climate change, some species aren't, even when migration would be possible when they have the dispersal ability. Some species appear to be adapting in situ to at least 1 degree of warming or considerable rainfall changes. And yet, if we look at the paleoecological record, like if you look at Europe for the last 20,000 years, there's nowhere in Europe where the species have remained the same. They've all completely changed. So, but the paleoecological record doesn't really tell us about what happens on a sort of 10, 20-year basis. I don't think we know enough yet, but we should certainly do experiments with manipulating gene flow. I think this is certainly a possibility.
I think we don't have any more questions, so I will close with one question from me. We haven't mentioned digital conservation. So then we're talking about collecting, live plants in ex situ collections, we're collecting germ sperms, germ seed banks. What about how far are we? Is going to be a reality? Collecting just the genetic information as a statistical string in a computer that one day we can just print and bring them back to.
Yeah, I actually had a slide on this, which I removed to shorten the presentation. But yes, if you had a complete genome or a pangenome, which sort of includes the genetic variation at many points, you've got many of the values of the plant are there. Currently, you can't de-extinct the plant from a pangenome, and but you could potentially use it to edit the genome of a close relative to make it more like the extinct one. Certainly, if I had the last plant of species X in my hands, I would get a complete genome first, because if the species becomes extinct, if this plant dies, and botanic gardens do lose plants from living collections. They lose plants from seed collections. It's not 100% foolproof yet, but if you've got a complete genome, then potentially in the future you have at least some of the values of that plant. So it's not a substitute, but I would do it as well as kind of the ultimate backup, the sequence in GenBank.
Yeah, Kwek Yan, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, it's basically de-extinction, right? Like in a Jurassic Park kind of sense. But I guess it's also, I think, at the end of the day, it's also about relative cost. So, I mean, I agree that there should be, some research on this, but I think, yeah, if in terms of cost effectiveness, other strategies are going to be far more effective, then this should be kept as like a potential last trump card or joker card. But yeah, maybe don't bet on it.
Yeah, I should say on that there are now projects to do whole genomes for 100,000 plant species, I think. So there are, and there are plans and hopes to have whole genome sequences of all plant species, which will be in this global meta-herbarium. So I would give priority to endangered species when doing whole genomes, because often initially you do one representative for a family. Now we've got whole genomes for probably almost every plant family. You do one representative for a genus, say Sharia. Well, you may as well take a critically endangered Sharia and do a whole genome sequence for that. So it doesn't necessarily use more resources. It's using existing resources. Also, it's much easier to get money to sequence a genome than it is to conserve plants.
Richard, maybe I could ask you another question. In the talk of de-extinction, there's often been the concern whether there's this problem of a moral hazard once you are able to de-extinct a species, something like saving banks from collapsing, where people start to get complacent about extinctions. Do you think that that's actually a logical argument, and that might be
it's not an argument yet, but potentially yes for large vertebrates. I mean, we have a single viable population of the Javan rhinoceros. If we manage to de-extinct another species of rhinoceros, that might reduce the incentive to preserve the last population. I really don't know. Potentially, but I'm not sure it's a big problem. When you talk about conservation, it's very easy to come up with problems. And so what I've tried to do is to focus simply on solutions. And when we come to the problems, I think if we try and target zero plant extinction, we're going to run into problems. We're going to run into species that we can't work out a cryo protocol for, that all our plant specimens have died or whatever. Then we have problems. But I'd rather worry about those real problems when we get them than come up with problems beforehand.
Okay, so I think we will wrap up here. Thank you very much, both of you, and Richard and Kwek Yan. I think has been really interesting, and I think there have been a lot of new questions and things to discuss. So please feel upload virtually. We don't have we missed that part of this kind of events. And then just as a summary, I think it's very important the idea that there is no technical reason why species could go extinct. Land plant species is not the same dealing with rhinoceroses or tigers. That there is not the same not going extinct that being effectively conserved, but that's a different question. That there are a number of shortfalls about what we have out there, where things are, and what is the status of populations, and these need to be addressed to be able to know how to prevent these extinctions, and that they will require a lot of resources, including a lot of human capital, institutional changes, and mainstreaming and engaging other people who might be oblivious right now to plants. They might not be paying much attention to the value of plants. So then I think it's exciting to see roadmaps that are positive in terms of things that can be done, rather than just talking about how bad things are. So thank you very much for the inspiring talk. And just reminding to the audience that next month, on 28th of April, we will have Professor James Watson. And then on the 16th of May, we'll have Professor Stuart Pym. And don't miss our new issue on integrative conservation, and see you in 4 weeks. So thank you very much. And
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Dosa.
Bye.
Bye.